I'm super pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Paul Bloom. Paul is a Canadian psychologist who did his initial training at McGill and then inexplicably decided to go down south and go to a university that doesn't even have a name, just an acronym, MIT. So this little technical college in Massachusetts is where he did his PhD. And then he spent some time in Arizona, where I guess he didn't find the weather inviting, because he came back and took a position at another very small college named after a rich dude, Elihu Yale, and spent, 20 some odd years at Yale? Yeah. He eventually, despite his inauspicious beginnings, managed to publish, a couple hundred articles. Actually, I do know exactly how many, but I'm not going to tell you because I'm embarrassed by it. And something like 8 books, bestsellers, on various topics. And then finally, wised up, moved back north, where he's now a professor at the University of Toronto. Now, some of you maybe have heard this city. It's a suburb of London, about an hour and a half to the east. And it has a decent university, University of Toronto. It's not Western, but it's good that you're coming up in the world. So anyway, without further ado, we're going to have a lovely lecture. I guess you're talking about perverse ideas. So please join me in a warm welcome for Paul Bloom.
Thank you for the gracious introduction. I am going to talk about perversity, perverse actions. And I want to start with this guy. About 2,400 years ago, St. Augustine of Hippo wrote the Confessions, where he talked about his youthful descent into sin and his later conversion to Christianity. And book 2 of the Confessions begins with this remarkable sentence: I propose now to set down my past wickedness and the carnal corruption of my soul. So young readers through history have read this and said, there's going to be a lot of sex coming up. But surprisingly, Augustine hardly talks about sex. He puts most of his emphasis on a single sin committed by him and his friends, as when he was a teenager. And the sin was this: they went into an orchard and they stole some pears. And that was it. But Augustine was fascinated by the sin. He didn't have anything against the owner of the orchard. He wasn't hungry. He threw the pears to pigs. As he goes on to say, it was not the pears that my unhappy soul desired. I had plenty of my own, and I only picked those so that I might steal. For no sooner did I pick them than I threw them away and tasted nothing in them but my own sin, which I relished and enjoyed. And then he concludes, I love the evil in me. This is what we call in the business a perverse action. An action done because it's wrong, because it's stupid, because it's irrational. And as I began to work on this, I started the Perversity Project, where I went online and I asked people to send me stories of perverse actions that they did or that they witnessed. I define these as when you choose to do something you know is wrong morally or otherwise, at least in part because it's wrong. Like breaking a rule just for the sake of breaking it, or doing something stupid just for the sake of doing something stupid. And so the stories came in, and sometimes they were of cruel acts. One woman wrote me and said, flirted with a woman's boyfriend knowing full well he liked me. I knew I could steal him if I wanted, but I didn't want to do that. I just wanted her to feel uncomfortable whenever 3 of us were in the same room. Causing people pain is wrong, but this is exactly why I did it. Sometimes the acts were self-destructive. Ice skating on a pond, dark and frozen spot 30 yards out. Instead of avoiding it, I skate towards it, knowing but wondering, and splash. Psychologists have been interested in sort of perversely cruel acts. The sort of big example of this in pop culture is the Joker. In Christopher Nolan's film, Alfred, Batman's butler, says, some men don't want money. They can't be bought, they can't be bullied, they can't be reasoned with. Some men just want the world to burn. And psychologists have come up with a scale called the need for chaos scale, which measures for each one of you how much you want the world to burn. So in the privacy of your own head, answer questions like this. How much do you agree with these statements? Statements like, I think society should be burned to the ground. I need chaos around me. It's too boring if nothing is going on. Or sometimes I just feel like destroying beautiful things. But not all the stories I got were cruel in the same sense. A young guy wrote to me saying, on one occasion in my early 20s, I was out with a friend. He decided to get himself an ice cream. And before he had a chance to try it, I stuck my finger in it. I played it off as a joke. But really, I had a sudden thought, man, I'd be fucked up if I just jammed my finger in his ice cream. Somebody else wrote, when I was in a professional choir as a child, at every concert I felt the desire to sing a few notes very incorrectly on purpose. To this day, I don't completely understand why. And somebody else wrote, and this is the saddest and sweetest example of perversity I've ever seen. Sometimes I walk on the grass instead of the path just because it's wrong. Once I started thinking about perversity, I started finding it everywhere. There's a wonderful book called Profane Waste, which is a series of photographs of people destroying valuable things like pouring champagne down a drain or setting fire to money. A recent review of Bullet Train in the New Yorker begins with this. Asked why he chose to wear a skirt to the premiere of his latest film, Brad Pitt replied, we're all going to die, so let's mess it up. Psychologists study a lot of things that go wrong, a lot of weird things, but perverse acts tend to be different. So they're not errors, they're not mistakes, nor are they caused by weakness of will. They're not cases where we want to do something, but we're tempted not to, or we lose control or something. Perversity, in a sense I'm interested in, is separate from sexual perversity, though it's related. My friend Jesse Bering wrote a wonderful book called Perv, if you're interested in that kind of perversity. It's more like this, as the philosopher David Sussman puts it. Perverse actions are those actions undertaken when the normal desire for the good, perhaps the moral good, or maybe just the narrow good of self-interest, is reversed. And my colleague at Toronto, Sergio Tenenbaum, distinguishes two sorts of perversity. There's what you could call a sort of strong perversity, where the agent just wants to do something just because it's bad, period. There's no other factor involved. There's just this direct desire to do bad. And we see this sometimes in fiction, as in the character of Hannibal Lecter. And this is often how Satan is depicted. In fact, Milton's description as Satan described a perfect inversion of good or bad and bad when he says, evil be thou my good. That is, what good is to normal people, evil is to me. But I don't think, I want to be agnostic as to whether or not this occurs. But I think that there's another form of perversity that's more common. And this is when, so we could doubt whether this sort of thing is even possible, but the other sort of perversity is when we have some motivation to do bad. We want to do it because it's bad, but there's a further reason. And Tenenbaum goes on to say this, which I think is right. If someone insists that Satan's motivation is really just to pursue the bad as such, aren't we tempted to ask, what's the good of it? What's the good of being bad? Aren't we tempted to look for a deeper motive? And that's what I'll be doing. I'll be looking for a deeper motive. That is, I'll be looking for how to fill in these question marks where an agent does something bad. What's the mediating goal or mediating desire? I want to talk about 4 different views. One view is explored by the late psychologist Dan Wegner, and he was talking primarily about perverse thoughts. So his research program was motivated by a famous quote from Dostoevsky. Try to pose for yourself this task, not to think of a polar bear, and you will see that the cursed thing will come to mind every minute. And this is what Wegner did. He did a series of studies where he told some group of people, just do whatever you want, and report your thoughts into a tape recorder. And other people, he said, don't think of a white bear. And he found that telling people not to think of a white bear caused the white bear thoughts to go much more frequent. Some of them times lasting till the next day. White bear thoughts would intrude upon their lives. And there's other research showing this shows up all over the place. Trying to keep a secret under some circumstances ups the odds you'll blurt it out. Holding a racial stereotype in mind and saying, I'm not going to talk about this, it's wrong to talk about this, ups the odds of it showing up. And these are laboratory studies, but in everyday life, it's not hard to think of how, in the domains of sex and sleep, these are activities that are often interrupted by the very act of thinking about what you want to attain. And yet, it's very hard not to think about it sometimes, which keeps a lot of self-help writers and psychiatrists and doctors in business. It also shows up, by the way, in sport. There's been many a career ruined where all of a sudden a trained athlete whose motions and skills are entirely unconscious suddenly becomes conscious of them and can't get them out of their head, something known as the yips. These thoughts sometimes percolate into action. This is Dan Wegner. We see a rut coming in the road ahead and proceed to steer our bike right into it. We make a mental note not to mention a sore point in conversation and cringe in horror as we blurt out exactly that thing. We carefully create a glass of red wine as we cross the room, all the time when thinking, don't spill, and then juggle it onto the carpet under the gaze of our host. Wegner has a theory as to why we do these things. Basically, when you try not to think of something, you set up a monitoring system in your mind that checks to see if this thought occurs. But the monitoring system itself is kind of leaky. And so as you search for the thing you shouldn't think about, that thing which you shouldn't think about comes to mind. Wegner also proposed a cure, which is kind of common sense. Try to think about something else. And in fact, in his studies, if he tells the White Bear participants, try to think about red Volkswagen, that slightly diminishes White Bear thoughts. But nobody has a cure for this problem, not yet. If it's any solace, it was worse when we were young and when our frontal lobes were not fully developed and self-control was harder. A friend of mine tells a story of how when he was having a birthday party, he was invited over to his sister's house, and his niece was age 5, was carefully instructed not to tell him that they were baking him a pie. And she struggled with this. And then when he opened the door, she ran up to him and she screamed at the top of her lungs, "There is no pie!" But this isn't perversity in the sense we're interested in, because the agent doesn't want the bad. The agent actually wants the good, and then a busted cognitive system produces the bad. So this looks perverse, but it isn't in the sense we're interested in. A second thing brings us back to Augustine. So Augustine talks about his pure desire for evil, but later on in the Confessions, he makes a confession of his own. I wouldn't have done it by myself. My satisfaction did not lie in the pears, it lay in the crime itself committed in league with a gang of sinners. And basically all sorts of crazy and masochistic things we do to impress other people. We don't do them when we're alone, we do them in crowds. Sometimes they're sort of intermediate cases. So a few years ago, Banksy did this incredible thing. He had a painting, Girl with a Red Balloon, sold at Sotheby's for over $1 million. And he arranged a frame such that when the gavel went down, a machine inside the frame started to work and shredded the painting halfway through. This is a picture of people stunned as this happens. Now, Banksy went on to quote a Russian anarchist, saying, the urge to destroy is also a creative urge. But my own somewhat cynical view is that Banksy wasn't being perverse at all. He wanted status. He wanted to show off. And in fact, this was an immensely successful stunt. That should be 3. Another motivation for perversity is unpredictability. And there's an example by the evolutionary theorist Robert Trivers, which I like, of a jackrabbit. So imagine a jackrabbit being chased by some large animal. And it's bouncing back and forth in an unpredictable pattern. And Trivers points out that if it knew what it was going to do next, it might give it away. So it's best for it not to know, so it can't show off its next move in any of its patterns. And there's sort of more human examples of this. My favorite example is that of Andy Beale. So Andy Beale is a banker, and he was also a poker player. He was a banker. He is a brilliant mathematician. With just an undergraduate degree in mathematics, he created a fundamental theorem in number theory, and he fancied himself a poker player. So with all of his money, he went to Vegas, and he played poker with some people, got bored, and he said, I want to play the best in the world. But I don't want to play on a table with everybody around me because you could collude against me. I want to play head-to-head, one-on-one. And so a group of the world's best poker players, and the story is told in that book, got together. They called themselves a corporation. And they funded one player after another to play him head-to-head. And over the course of a few days, Andy Beal lost $3 million and went back to Texas. When he was in Texas, he agonized over his failure, and he realized what went wrong. They were reading him. They were telling what he was thinking. And so he worked to block it. So they were trying to distract him with conversation. His conversation might leak out the power of his hand. So he wore huge earmuffs. The eyes are a tell. So he wore these giant, goofy sunglasses. But the biggest tell of all is how long it takes for him to choose how to bet. Because if it's an easy decision, you kind of bet quickly. If it's a hard one, you bet slower. So he put on his ankle a machine with a timer. And every 30 seconds, it squeezed his ankle. And he only bet when it squeezed, making his bets effectively random in timing. And he went back and he won $11 million. He then went to third time. The corporation put him up against this man, Phil Ivey, and he lost the biggest poker game in world history, $18 million. And as far as we know, he never returned to Vegas. Okay, unpredictability itself is not perversity. So you could be unpredictable in a non-perverse way. Ask me to choose a number from 1 to 1,000, I'll give you one. You couldn't predict it, there's nothing perverse by it. And some perverse acts can be predictable. But still, perversity is one route to unpredictability. Because the rational is usually predictable. Suppose you were going to murder me, and you wanted to murder me as I went to work. And you knew where my work was, and you knew where my home was. The smartest way to figure out the path I will take is to put both addresses into Google Maps and see the path, and intercept me in the path. If I want to be clever and avoid murder attempts, I'll behave randomly, and I won't take the rational path. I'll take other paths. So unpredictability can be one motivation for perversity. But there's another motivation discussed by the advertising executive, Rory Sutherland. So Sutherland writes, irrational people are much more powerful than rational people because their threats are much more convincing. And he gives, and we actually know this from the basic behavioral economics. So there's a wonderful experiment or game thought of by behavioral economists called ultimatum game. And here's how it goes. You have these two players, and you give one of them, say, 10 tokens. Each token could be worth $1. And they're told, you can give the other person as much as you want. The other person just has one option. They can either accept it or say, no, nobody gets anything, and spitefully refuse it all. Now, economists point out that the rational thing is to accept it. It's just a one-shot game. Somebody gives you $1 or $10 or $100, just take it. But people don't behave that way. If people get a lowball offer, like less than half, they say, screw you all. And they throw away all the money, including theirs. There's a cartoon that nicely captures an economist's way of thinking about it and why it's silly. Sutherland points out that the capacity to throw it all away and behave irrationally actually gives you an edge in certain dealings, including the ultimatum game. If I'm a perfectly rational agent, you deal with me, you give me the minimum, I'll take it. But if you know I'm crazy and will throw it away, you're forced to give me more money. And there's many illustrations of this. Sutherland points out, he wrote this during when the presidential election between Clinton and Trump, and he said, Trump's a better negotiator because Clinton's reasonable. She'll make threats, but people will say, the reasonable threats you'll follow through on, the unreasonable ones you won't. Trump is famously unreasonable, and that gives him a certain power. There's all these extreme examples of this. One extreme example of this is from Dennis Lehane's book, Live by Night, where a character, our main narrator, our narrator, is approached by a psychopathic mobster. And the psychopathic mobster tells our character, who's a criminal, he has to do this terrible act, or the mobster will murder his father. And so our character is thinking and trying to negotiate. And then the psychopathic mobster says, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what if you die doing this? Or what if you kill yourself? Well, says the psychopathic mobster, I'll kill your father anyway. And the narrator thinking, but that makes no sense. I'll be dead. It doesn't do any good. There's no way a reasonable person would follow through on this. But he knows he's not dealing with a reasonable person. So his threat is a powerful one. Sutherland goes on to write about some practical implications of this, talking about self-driving cars. If driverless cars start reliably whenever a pedestrian appears in front of them, pedestrian crossings will be unnecessary, and jaywalkers will be able to march into the road, forcing the driverless car to stop suddenly. To prevent this, driverless cars may learn to be angry and to occasionally maliciously fail to stop in time and strike the pedestrian on the shins. And the smart thing here is that he's pointing out the emotional force behind our behavior in the ultimatum game. Our behavior when we make threats that are irrational to fulfill. Our behavior when we hit a pedestrian in the shins. And this is an old idea. Robert Frank most famously pointed out that the emotions can guide us to irrational actions that are, in the context of interpersonal dealings, adaptive and powerful. And in this way, I'm not sure that this is perversity either, because the agent who makes the unrealistic threat, or any one of you when you're turned down a lowball offer in an ultimatum game, you aren't necessarily doing something bad by your own lights. You're doing something what you feel is right and actually good. The final two examples, I think, are more core perversity. A little while ago, there was what has been called the Tide Pod Challenge. And this is when teenagers would eat Tide Pods. And a lot of people got upset by this and said, you shouldn't eat Tide Pods. The Onion made fun of it. So help me God, I'm going to eat one of those multicolored detergent pods. And Procter & Gamble, which owned Tide, freaked out because people were eating them, and this is not good business, and some of them are going to die. So they spent an enormous amount of money doing an ad campaign where they got famous people to tell the youth not to eat the Tide Pods. They really got Gronk, who was apparently a famous football player and well-beloved. And in a video, they asked, hey, Gronk, is eating Tide Pods ever a good idea? And Gronk's answer was no. Jonah Berger, who tells this story, points out that when these ads came out, in the next few days and weeks that follows, the consumption of Tide Pods shot up. And only when Procter & Gamble had the good sense to stop putting out these ads and stop talking about it, did this fad slowly fade away. I gave the example of Augustine and his pears, but this is only the second most famous story of a perverse act involving fruit. The most famous one, of course, is Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. And medieval theologians were not unaware of the fact that she did the one thing she was told not to. The idea of something forbidden becoming tempting is a common trope. My favorite example is from my favorite TV show, Better Call Saul, where Jimmy McGill finally settles down to a job. A good job will end his life of misbehavior and impulsive actions. And he's in his new office looking at it, and his eyes fall to this, a switch that says, always leave on, do not turn off. And the final scene is him peeling away the sticker so he could throw that switch. There's a field of social psychology known as reactance theory that explores the psychology behind this. An idea of reactance theory is the reactance is an unpleasant feeling that exists when people experience a threat or loss of their free behaviors. And this motivates them to reestablish the threatened freedom. And there's all sorts of data from all sorts of studies. Vaccine mandates, for some people, make people less reluctant to get vaccines. Warnings, you shouldn't smoke. If they're too aggressive, they make people smoke more because people are saying, basically, don't tell me what to do. There's some lovely studies by political scientists involving threats of reprisal. So in one of these studies, they get people to, they say, okay, you're a high-ranking government official, and you have to decide whether to do an arms embargo against this country. And in one condition, that's just this whole situation. In the second condition, the dictator of the country says, if you do an arms embargo against us, I'm going to unleash terrorist attacks against your country. People in the second condition are more enthusiastic about the arms embargo, not less. The threat motivates them to do it. There's a broader form of constraint. It doesn't come in the form of somebody telling you not to do something or somebody trying to bully you into a behavior, but more in terms of the sort of constraints of everyday life. And this is a concern of many existential philosophers, and again, was nicely described by Dostoevsky. So Dostoevsky has, in Notes from Underground, has a character wailing, fighting against the constraints of rationality. He says, 2 times 2 makes 4 seems to me simply a piece of insolence. 2 times 2 makes 4 is a fop, standing with arms akimbo, barring your path and spitting. If we're going to praise everything, 2 times 2 makes 5 is also a very charming thing. In collaboration with the philosopher Laurie Paul, I did a survey and a discussion of a set of studies on how we make decisions and how we react to information sources. And basically, there's certain sets of cases where, when given perfectly good advice we would grant is reasonable and rational, we turn it down, we refuse it. This is known as algorithm aversion, where even when there's an algorithm, an AI, ChatGPT, whatever, that you believe is better, you still won't want to use it sometimes. And deliberation aversion, even if you think thinking things out will give you a better answer, you don't want to do that. Now, I'm qualifying this a bit because this does not, sometimes you find algorithm aversion, deliberation aversion, sometimes you don't. And the difference seems to be that you find it in cases when authenticity plays a role. So if I'm deciding what's the best source of gasoline for my car, or what's the best use of my air miles, I'm happy to deliberate, I'm happy to appeal to an algorithm. But when I'm struggling with a question like who to marry or where I should live, I want to go with my gut, I want to go with my heart. I don't want to lose my autonomy. Just as an aside, many people, including the scholar Joseph Henrich, believe that this appetite for autonomy is something particular to Western culture. He writes, we see ourselves as unique beings, not as nodes in a social network that stretches out through space and back in time. When acting, we, Westerners, people raised in the West, prefer a sense of control and the feeling of making our own choices. He might be right. This may be a product of our cultural upbringing, but I doubt it. And here's why I doubt it. I doubt it because I find you see the urge for autonomy emerges very early. Even 2-year-olds, sometimes younger, will have screaming tantrums when they don't get what they want, when they feel constrained, even if the practical value of what they want is very small. A friend of mine tells me of his 2-year-old who threw a total fit because they're driving in the car, they're both in their car seats, and his brother was looking out his side of the window. And I think to the extent these things emerge early, we could find autonomy emerges early. And so the urge for autonomy, I think, underlies a lot of seemingly perverse behavior. Finally, the episode of the TV show Seinfeld called The Opposite is, according to IMDb, has the highest ranking of every episode. And you don't have to have seen it to follow what's going to go on. That would help. The scene begins with George, who's this hapless loser, saying to his friends, "It all became very clear to me sitting out there today that every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be." Then his friend Jerry comes up with some advice. Every instinct I have in every aspect of life, be it something to wear, something to eat, it's all been wrong, everyone. And here's Jerry's advice. If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right. And George takes his advice and starts doing the opposite of all of his desires and goals. And this being a comedy, it all works wonderful for him. This beautiful woman falls in love with him. He gets a better job. He moves out of his parents' house. Now, as I was sort of thinking about it, as I Googled the term, and to my tremendous shock, there's advice for startup companies that say, this is what you should do the opposite. Now, I think in general, this is terrible advice. For one thing, it's not even clear what the opposite is in some cases. So what's the complete opposite of tuna on toast? For another, it's not even true. I mean, George wears clothes, he talks English, he only does the opposite of certain things. And so, in general, doing the opposite is stupid, but usually stupid. I think there are certain cases where this sort of perverse action can really pay off. One is if you really are so bad at something, a certain class of decisions, that you're worse than random. So, and George is this way with every aspect of his life, apparently. And I'm kind of that way with directions. My sense of directions is so bad that it has been suggested to me I just follow my instinct and flip it. The second one is, and I need a pithy name for this, but the idea is you need to stand out in a crowded field of rational agents. In other words, you're competing with a bunch of people who are all very smart and rational. And so being smart and rational, I bet you'll just tie. So my example here is Wordle. All you have to know about Wordle, if you've never played it, it's a word game, and you have to guess a word, and then the machine will tell you how well you did at guessing the target word, how many letters match, how many letters are close, and everything. And my wife plays Wordle, and she always begins with the same word, and she's gave me permission to reveal her word. Her word is crate. Now, if you look it up, crate's an extremely rational word. It has high-frequency letters in the right place and everything. It's really strategic. Me, I'm different. I wake up every morning, and I think of my own word. So one night I had a dream about puppies, so I put in puppy. That day, greatest day of my life, the target word was guppy. And I got it in 2. So who wins? Whose strategy is better overall? My wife's. She wins almost all the time. But if we were ever playing a world champion Wordle game where the person who gets it right wins and time isn't good for anything, my strategy is the best. If you're in a crowded field, I don't know, graduate school, where everybody's smart, being smart will not get you there on the top. You have to be in some way perverse. Finally, there's what you could call hopeful monsters. There's a famous line, I think Leibniz says, nature doesn't make jumps. Nature moves in gradual, careful steps. And this is, of course, the insight behind natural selection, which is species evolve in a sort of gradual way by making tiny increments over time. The ones that are more adaptively successful, they go on to you generate from those and so on and so forth. And one way in which people think about this is in terms of an adaptive landscape. So the way to read this is these are a space of different possibilities, and the higher up, the better. And from the standpoint of an individual, or from the standpoint of an evolving species, if you're right here and you're just looking around for the possibilities, you should proceed and you'll end up there. And that's not bad. But there's a problem here. What if there's another peak far away? And you could never get there through increments because in every step of the direction it's irrational and unreasonable. And here's the idea of hopeful monsters. So the claim is, and this is hotly contended, so I'm treating it more like an analogy, is that in evolutionary history, there's been certain macro mutations that have taken organisms in entirely different directions. Usually, they're fatal. They send you off into loser land. But sometimes, they bring you up to higher peaks. And so the idea here, translating it into life, is if everything is going well for you, stop. Just be rational and stick where you are. But if you were in a rut and you were failing, sometimes it might benefit you to take a leap. And here, the desire to do bad is generated, the ultimate bad behavior, the perverse behavior is generated by an ultimate desire to do good. Now, I've given you all of these different sorts of examples. And I want to end with different sorts of perversity. And I want to end with 3 general points. First, my list is incomplete. There are other motivations for perversity I haven't talked about. So for instance, there's boredom. There's research suggesting that a lot of really bad behavior is generated simply by boredom. There's a nice study out of Aaron Westgate's lab, which finds that the relationship between boredom and sadism generalizes across a variety of important societal contexts, including online trolling, sadism in the military, sadistic behavior among parents, and sadistic fantasies, as well as experimentally inducing boredom increases sadistic behavior, killing worms, destroying other participants' pay. The second point is, I think there's a range of behaviors, a range of motivations for perverse behaviors. Some which seem maybe not to truly count as perversity, others that are more like true perversity. So here's one example. It's from a study on risk-taking behavior in adolescents. And it points out, comparing to adults, adolescents show an unbalanced and extreme-oriented behavior, increased novelty-seeking, decreased novelty-induced stress and anxiety, increased risk-taking behavior, elevated levels of impulsiveness and restlessness. Anybody who's been there an adolescent can get a flavor of this. Is this a highly cognitive thing where it's done strategically? I doubt it, because I've only given you part of the title. It's in adolescent mice. So probably not. Then on the other extreme, there's the perversity of humor and comedy, where characters do silly things. And they knowingly do silly things to make us laugh. And we know that this is why they're doing the silly things. And there's no true perversity here. There's this sort of a mock perversity for entertainment. And then there's cases like the Banksy case, which I think is nicely intermediate, where it's bad in some way, the shredding of the valuable painting. But maybe it's seen by others as irrational and immoral, but seen by the agent as rational and moral. It's strategic. It's like somebody making a threat, but a crazy threat. But they're making a crazy threat because they know it's going to have tangible, smart results. And then there's true perversity. True perversity in the case that the agent does something perverse and doesn't quite know why they're doing it. And it feels to them that they're doing it because they're wrong. The final point is, I think thinking about perversity matters, both for everyday life, but also for the science of the mind. It's really useful to keep in mind that some men just want the world to burn. And it's useful keeping in mind that maybe all of us sometimes want the world to burn. I think it's useful knowing that people will do perverse acts, sometimes just chafing against authority. And this could explain things like voting behavior, where sometimes people choose to vote in ways just because everybody says if you vote this way, it's irrational and immoral. Sometimes perversity shows up in art. Favorite example of a perverse action in art is Marcel Duchamp in 1917, when there's a famous art competition in New York where they say they will accept every piece of art that's submitted to them. So he sends in a urinal, and they reject it. And the controversy that followed from this audacious act is viewed by many as one of the most foundational moments in modern art. And sometimes it's just worth understanding and worth appreciating that sometimes people just stick their finger into another bro's ice cream for fun. But I think perversity is not only of practical value. I think it's been ignored too much by scholars of the mind. And so I want to end with a quote by the philosopher David Velleman, which very much resonates with me. Velleman writes, "The agent portrayed in much philosophy of action is, let's face it, a square. Our moral philosophy has characterized a particular species of agent, and a particularly bland species of agent at that. It has characterized an earnest agent, while ignoring those agents who are disaffected, refractory, silly, satanic, or punk. I hope for a moral psychology that has room for the whole motley crew." And so do I. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Is this on yet? Thanks, Paul. So we have plenty of time and plenty of room for questions.
Hi, thank
Hey.
you. I'm wondering if in your different views, there is room for doing evil for evil at the end of the day, or it seemed that we could see a lot of these examples as examples where the agent that perform wrong actions do it because in a way for them it's good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was seeing a lot of maybe political views there where people could think, I'm gonna vote that bad because the world needs to collapse, or I want the world to burn because it's so bad as it is now that it needs to revolutionize in a way, or something like that. And I'm wondering if we couldn't see everything through this lens if we follow these different things, or if bad for bad exists according to you.
That's a great question. In every case of perversity that I've talked about, the perversity is in a sense instrumental. There's some goal they have in mind. They may not know it. I mean, I may sort of say, you tell me you're only an idiot would vote for Trump, screw you, I'm gonna vote for Trump. You might tell me, I might find myself acting unpredictably, not knowing why, even if it's strategic. So sometimes you might know it, and sometimes you don't, but it's always instrumental in some way. And your question is there such a thing as direct perversity, where you simply want bad for badness' sake? I'm kind of agnostic about this. There's a view in philosophy called the guise of the good that says to do anything requires you think it's in some way good. So, if I walk back to my hotel, I think, oh, that's rational because that's where I want to sleep and this is the right direction. It makes sense. It fits some higher order goods. Is it possible to imagine a creature like Satan, or think of any one of us, who does something bad, like blows up a building, and then when you ask, why did you do this? They don't give an answer. They say, because it was bad. And I am not sure. I'm skeptical. I think the explanation is stopped too soon. You need, but why? There has to be some other motivation. But I could be wrong. There's a lot of debate over that. Thank you for raising that.
Hi, so I'm wondering if you see a connection here between the phenomenon of moral licensing.
Yeah.
So for the most part, we live, fairly moral, upstanding lives, and that gives us something akin to sort of decision fatigue or willpower, exerting our willpower fatigue, and so every once in a while we need the relief that's provided to us by just giving in to our darker impulses. I wonder if there's something there.
I never thought of that, and I never thought about that. So moral licensing, just to
Sure.
elaborate, is a phenomena that psychologists study where having done one good thing, you're sort of more likely to do a bad thing following it. So there's these studies, for instance, where you ask people anonymously a question saying, is genocide wrong? And people say, yes, it's wrong. And having ticked that off, they're more likely to do something bad later on because I've done my good thing for today. I've expressed a good view. It depends kind of what you think. I think moral licensing could be a contributor to it because it's licensing. It says, here's something bad. I now have more of an excuse to do it. But I don't think, and I'm willing, I'm curious whether you have a different view, whether it could be a cause. So if you decide to shoot me, and sorry, just as I'm trying to. Fine. If you say something snide on social media about me, are you and then I say, why'd you do that? And you said, well, I was morally licensed. I gave to charity before, so I was licensed. I said, okay, that's raised the odds of you doing it, but I still kind of want to know why. Does that make sense? I also accept stories of personal perverse actions. I'm collecting. You could do them publicly, or you could just email me your stories. I am collecting them. If they're good enough, they'll end up in my book.
I have some for you.
Oh, I'm ready.
I'm serious. So I guess my question is, I wrote it down. Are there any studies, and I assume there are, equating personality types to the incidence and types of perversion? I think that's a straightforward question, and you can probably answer that quickly.
I could answer it quickly in saying, no, there are not such studies looking at perversion. If you were talking about violent behavior and cruelty, yes, there are correlating with personality types, pretty much what you would expect. So agreeability seems to be correlated with not doing bad things, unagreeability, doing bad things, and so on. Neuroticism is correlated with bad behavior in personal relationships.
Yeah.
Perverse acts, I don't know. That's a different question. Because not all bad acts are perverse.
Let me just add to that. How would you study that if you were to propose a study between personality types and perversity in your sense?
Yeah, I guess a bad way to do a study, but it's the way I would start, because that's how I start, is you simply ask people about the extent to which they do perverse actions in their lives. And then you get characteristics of them. Are they men or women? How old are they? Are they religious? What's their political affiliation? And what's their personality type?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to start. That's great, thank you. And I ordered your book today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If you have a perverse act you've done, but you don't want to talk about it, you could come up and say, a friend of yours did it. And then that would be fine.
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
So I have a question. It's more of, I guess, personal one, but with these perverse actions, do they decrease over time throughout your life, or do you continuously partake in those actions? I was reading a quote by Dostoevsky. He was saying something like, men are in love with suffering itself sometimes. So then is that sort of like things that we engage in throughout our whole life, or do we learn in a way?
I think that's a great question. And in fact, this is sort of a question I'd like to get the answer to in a systematic way. Based on anecdote, what people tell me, where you kind of read about, perverse behavior seems to peak at 3 points in life. One is when you're a toddler. One is when you're an adolescent. And the third one, and this may differ most culturally, is the so-called midlife crisis. When all of a sudden you leave your job and start, teaching banjo in Santa Fe or something like that. A friend of mine. And if you think about this, if I had to guess, this most fits an autonomy notion of perversity, because these are 3 points in life where you most want to assert your autonomy when you're 2 years old. So there's an interesting sort of debate or question about the behavior of young children. Why is there the terrible twos? And Alison Gopnik, a friend of mine, smart developmental psychologist, says the kids are like scientists. They want to explore, they want to push people's buttons and see what happens. I think that might be true, but I also think what they are is they desperately want to assert their freedom. And the way to assert their freedom is to do what they're not told. That's the way anybody asserts their freedom. Adolescence, there may be autonomy, there also may be a signaling function, particularly for men, where the risk-taking in adolescence for both humans and for mice shoots up. And this might be because you want to show the world you're to be reckoned with. You are fearless. You are not chained. The midlife crisis is more complicated, but that may be, for at least some of us, we feel as we see, the end approaching, we see ourselves locked into a life, we might say, if I only do what's smart, if I only do what's moral, what good am I? What good is my consciousness? One day you could just replace me with Chat GPT, and it will do that too. In order to assert myself like the mad person in Dostoevsky, you need to be perverse. That's a really interesting issue. Now, this is just based on anecdote and story. I'd love to see if it was true.
Well, it's true for me, in a sense.
Do you see yourself as a perverse agent?
Currently, yes.
Okay, good. Good,
Thank you.
good. Maybe afterwards we could get the details.
Hey, so you've mentioned AI a number of times in this talk. Do you think, given the ways in which AI is algorithm-driven, predictable, all of these things are the opposite of perversity, is the human impulse going to be towards more perversity because of the impact of AI?
I think that's a really clever thought, and you're the second person to propose it. The first one was and well,
I'm
build on
very
it.
unoriginal, so that's...
No, it's by the economist Tyler Cowen. And he said, basically, the worry was automation would come, and all of a sudden there'd be no more bartenders or plumbers or electricians and taxi cab drivers and all that, because the robots would do all that. Turned out we were wrong. Those tasks involving the physical world are incredibly hard to copy. They involve an intelligence and a skill and a power that can't be duplicated. But things like journalism and writing scientific review papers, that seems to be what AI is really good at. So, giving advice from a sort of marketing, where do you go? If you are the kind of person who can write really workmanlike summaries of the news and write blog posts that capture conventional wisdom, you've been replaced. What the people who are going to be viewed as exceptional, who are going to rise above this, are people who can act distinctively. He didn't say perversely, but distinctively. Sometimes that involves perversity, sometimes it involves skills that machines can't do, like being a gardener or being an athlete or being maybe a musician. But when it comes to writing, the advice to give to people for the next 20 years isn't, here's some rules for good writing, good, clear, sensible writing. It's write like a freak. Write in a distinctive, freakish way. And then people will read you who want the distinctive, freakish stuff. If you want the mundane stuff, you've been replaced by a machine. Does that sound right?
Well, so this gets to the question of the relationship between creativity and perversity. And I take it from your talk, those are different things. So how do you want to speak to that issue?
They're different in the sense that perversity, by my definition, by the standard definition, involves doing something wrong. And creativity can just be brilliant and appreciated. Creativity and perversity overlap in the Venn diagrams when the creative act is such that people find it morally appalling or stupid. So religiously blasphemous art, for instance, can be both creative and perverse. A lot of the stuff that I really like that are in museums and everything is just creative and not perverse. And there's a lot of perverse stuff like random acts of violence, which are not creative. But the diagram intersects, I think, when things are viewed as, when people say, we want that off the shelves. We want to ban that. We want to imprison the person. Then you know, but other people view it as brilliant. Then you're in that overlap.
So for you then, perversity always involves a kind of a morally negative dimension?
Not always morally, often morally. And those are the cases I'm most interested in. It could be simply irrational. It could be unreasonable. It could be, for instance, just to say, you have to make a decision to make, right? And the information is all in front of you. And you say, I'm going to flip a coin. And it really matters. It's not going to hurt anybody except for yourself, but it really matters. So morally, yes, but also wrong from a rational standpoint.
Let me just one more thing. I think Chris wants to come up here. I can see him moving. So the fitness landscape thing is intriguing to me, because that's a place where what you might call perversity and what you might call rationality actually kind of coincide in a way, right? So maybe you have a sense, or maybe you don't, but you just flip the coin, that you're in a local minimum or a local maximum. And so you decide to just move to a totally different part of the fitness landscape because now there's a better hill to climb. But you describe that also as a potentially perverse.
Yeah.
So
you're right, which in some cases it could just make good sense to, well, quit your job and take another job. Or for an animal to sort of just mutate and go somewhere. The cases I'm thinking about are where there's some sort of instrumental rationality of that sort. But on balance, it's stupid. And the idea of the hopeful monster, like, I would never, I have two sons who I love dearly. I would, if they asked me, Dad, can you give me some life advice? Never happen. But if it ever did, I would say, son, do the opposite. No, I think it's idiotic. But
Don't climb down the hill.
That's right. Don't stay on top of your hill and just be quiet. You're good there. Send me money every month when I get older. So yeah. So what makes it irrational is that most hopeful monsters die. Or most creatures that, in some metaphorical sense, aspire to be hopeful monsters just die. Mutations are bad for you. You don't turn into one in X-Men. You just die.
Thanks so much. So the question I had was sort of more inspired by the Velleman quote right at the end. So thinking of moral psychology is not thinking of agents just as squares. But the way he characterized it was as if we would have different types of agents.
Yeah.
And most of your talk, it seemed more like for any agent, there might be many dimensions that are revealed in different episodes, right? So that even I, even though I usually think of myself as probably a relatively square agent, sometimes I might decide to just burn things down, right? So, is that your picture? That's more a question of episodic and sort of expanding the dimensions for each agent as opposed to... Yeah.
You're entirely right. If I could doctor the quote, because you're entirely right, I would say we shouldn't think about the square parts of our lives, time slices of our life, but sometimes we're punk, and sometimes we're disaffected, and sometimes we're satanic. Mm-hmm. And I do think that you can talk about individual differences. There are some people who are punk a lot of the day, mm-hmm. and some people not. But you're entirely right. I think all of these facets live within ourselves, both at different ages, mm-hmm. but also just on different times of day, at different, mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's right. I think that's a much better way of looking at things, so I agree.
Yeah. Could you just say a little bit more about how that would change? So I was originally thinking of an analogy. So thinking of behavioral economics is giving us a very different way of thinking about economic agents. It's actually much richer and in some ways very different. So your approach to moral psychology, would it be enriching the notion of the agent in something like that, or is that the wrong kind of analogy to think of?
So there's one of the correctives to an economic analysis, and to be fair to economists who often are described as idiots in these stories, and they aren't really idiots, a lot of work is done by economists, points out that we often act in ways that are short-term irrational, but they make sense if you think of us as evolved for a longer-term existence. If we're driving and you cut me off, so who cares from a sort of rational point of view? I'm never going to see you again. But the story goes, we're not evolved to deal with one-shot interactions. If we were living in a small community and I saw you every day and you in some way disrespected me, I have to address that. But otherwise it's going to happen tomorrow and next day and next day. And once you understand it inside and mind, people's economic behavior sort of makes a lot more sense. So that's work that's been done. One of the things which I think I'm exploring, and is hardly new to me, but I'm sort of trying to express and amplify, is that there's certain motivations which have been ignored by economists and by psychologists too. I say reactance theory, and like professional social psychologists, about half of them have even heard of it. It was sort of a cult movement in the 70s and faded in the 90s, and a little bit of work here and there. But I think the core insight, the need for autonomy, something we have hugely underestimated its importance. We do laboratory studies that don't leave any room for it. But I think the idea to be autonomous, to be unconstrained, is extremely powerful. And I think to some extent, advertisers and marketers and political analysts have come to realize, way before philosophers and psychologists, the paradoxical effects of telling people that they're stupid, or telling people you got to do this. And so that's sort of the way I would expand a sort of economic view. Now, is valuing autonomy rational or irrational? I think it's I think there's nothing plainly pathological. We value different things. Autonomy is one of them. I personally think it's a good thing to value. I'd like to nurture it in people. It's a good virtue to have.
So you kind of mentioned briefly that you didn't think that this need for autonomy was a culturally relative phenomenon. Do you want to say any more about that?
So I ended up arguing against that.
Oh, okay.
So the more I'll say is that some people, like Henrik, think this is a product of Western culture. Autonomy is a value nurtured in some societies. The majority of people in the world who have ever lived don't have an autonomy urge. They actually have much more of a belongingness urge. And I think there's reasons to believe that it's amplified in countries like Canada and the United States relative to the rest of the world. But I also wouldn't be surprised to find that it's a human universal, that you would find it everywhere, that it's part of the basic drives that humans possess. And so I'm a developmental psychologist in my day job, and so the way I would go to address that question is look at kids, look at babies even, and see if it emerges very early, before enculturation has gotten full steam, then it seems that the universalist claim has some teeth. On the other hand, if autonomy are just real, and the toddler anecdotes are just anecdotes, and autonomy only emerged around 7 or 8, that would support the cultural theory. And again, that's an area sort of ripe for investigation. Hi.
Hello. So when you describe all of these kinds of other explanations for these apparently perverse actions that aren't truly perverse, I find that there doesn't seem to be I don't seem to have a reaction to those like I do with the truly perverse ones. So with the truly perverse ones, it's like, well, wait, but why? There must be some reason. Like, that's what started off in the talk. Why do you think there's a difference there? Why do you think that when we associate some good with an apparently perverse action, we don't feel like there's a need for an explanation in the same way that we do when we say, just because it was bad?
Good. There's 2 good questions in here. One is almost a matter of framing. So I could have framed this talk and the stuff I'm writing in a different way, and this is what you're getting at, which is I could say, there's no such thing as perverse actions. People never behave perversely. There's things which look perverse, but if you look closely, they're to satisfy some value, they're to outcompete somebody, there's this, there's that. And that perversity, by definition, requires a sort of, it cannot be instrumentally successful. It cannot be smart in any way. And so I tend to use the word perversely in a broader way to sort of include apparently perverse. But I'm just as comfortable if you want to take away, if the moral you want to take away, there's no such thing as, I used to think there were perverse actions. There aren't perverse actions. Because for every perverse action, maybe I could think of an explanation for it. So it's not perverse. Does that make sense?
So that is your position?
My position is it depends how you define perversity. One way, if you define perversity broadly, here's a bunch of theories of perversity. If you define it narrowly, you say, here's a bunch of theories as to why there's no such thing as perversity. And I don't think anything rests on it. It's just there's 2 different words. You could use them different ways. There's another question you raised, and I'll answer that, but you look unhappy with my first answer, so I'll get that. But is that I do think good things require less explanation than bad things, because good things often, for instance, have an adaptive explanation. So if I behave in some way because it fills my belly, or puts a roof over my head, or protects my children, well, why do I want those things? Well, Darwin, you tell an evolutionary story. If I do something which in fact, helps me get promoted to, associate professor, why that? Well, cultural things too. Those are sort of standard goals with standard things. The bad things are harder to explain. If I cut myself, if I hurt my children for no reason, those are puzzles because we don't have the same sort of explanations.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Hey,
Thank you so much for the great talk.
thank you.
So I just had a question about how much insight that we have into these perverse thoughts ourselves. So I guess there could be 2 different scenarios. One, we have really good insight. So when we are doing a perverse thought, we know exactly why we're doing that. And there's other situations where we don't know why we're doing it, and we come up with some sort of explanation. So you brought something up about Banksy. So he had a reason for doing it, but then you're like, oh no, he actually did it for status reasons. So if we don't have good insight into why we're doing these things, then how can we know the, I guess, ultimate justification for perverse action? How can we implement that in the world and know that it's a good time
Yeah.
to be implementing these perverse actions?
Yeah, there's actually not just 2 categories. There's 4. Well, there's 3 at least. There's ones where we don't know. There's ones where we know, or we believe this is why I did it, and we're right. And then there's a category where we think this is why I did it, and we're wrong. And that's a possibility too. And so you can see these different categories. So for instance, if I'm trying to amuse my children and I act all silly, well, I'm acting perversely in a sense, but I know what I'm doing. They know what I'm doing. It's just all conscious. Some acts that we do perversely are mysteries to ourselves. Augustine was just freaked out by him stealing the pears. He just bases that story on the book. Later on, he says, maybe it was my friends, but then later on, he says, maybe it wasn't. I don't know why I did that. How do we know? Well, the standard tools of psychology. So for instance, if it is due to autonomy or desires, you might imagine people who show high desire for autonomy measured some different way will be more perverse. You might expect it happens at a certain time of life. It may be prompted in some way. So for instance, if autonomy is central to perverse behavior, if I restrain your autonomy in some way, perverse behavior should go up. This is standard tools which psychologists investigated. It may never rise to consciousness. You might always say, okay, I guess this guy has a theory of what I did and whatever, but it doesn't feel right. And there's always that possibility.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an awesome talk. My question's very basic, but just based on the accounts that you have from people and telling their stories and like the evolutionary history behind it, I'm wondering what you think you're taught, what kind of implications it would have on the debate between objective morality and subjective morality.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So between like being a sort of a realist about morality and a relativist, is that
Yeah,
what you mean?
I'm thinking more of like Plato saying that we're all inherently selfish and egoists and that we kind of only abide to law because
Yeah.
we have to, kind of thing, yeah.
So there's a broader philosophical debate, as you're aware, as to the sort of status of moral things. So when somebody says killing is wrong, is that like a fact in some way, an objective fact about the world that could be true or false, or does it just capture a belief system or social consensus or so on? And I'm not sure that this work has any bearing on that or the deeper philosophical questions. I've never used this expression before in my life, but it's above my pay grade. Meta-ethics. Can't do meta-ethics. Just can't. Below my pay grade. I don't get paid much. But anyway, but then there's the other question which you alluded to, which is a really good one, which is what does this imply about moral psychology? And there is a premise I have that underlies a lot of this work, and I'm glad you recognize it's kind of tacit, is that we're moral beings. We want to do good. We start off with, and it's a whole other talk making this case, with a moral sense where we can judge, we have some rudimentary capacity to judge good and evil in others, and we have a desire to do good, to do the moral. Now, doing the moral is often involves helping people and soothing some. You find in babies and young children, it often involves punishing people. It often involves humiliating and shaming and all sorts of things. So a lot of the dark side of our actions are themselves sort of morally based. And this makes the question, by the way, of what's a perverse act and what's not a perverse act complicated. So people torture one another in times of war. And there's some sense of where perverse just means awful, so that's perverse. But I don't think that's perverse in any interesting sense. I think they're doing it because they were ordered to do so, they're doing it because they think it's efficacious, or they're doing it because they think the people they're torturing are bad people and this is what they deserve. And that's a very moral view. Now, in some abstract sense, it may be wrong, but it's morally motivated. And so to answer your question, I'm sort of running under an assumption that we have moral motivations underlying all of this. I mean, in fact, if you think about it, you need some moral capacities, wherever it comes from. Augustine wouldn't have stolen the pears if it wasn't wrong. He's kind of an inversion of things, but if he had a true moral psychopath who had no sense of right and wrong could never be a perverse agent. Just like somebody who has no conception of truth, a perfect bullshitter, couldn't lie. So but that's a cool issue. I've never thought of linking this to morality in that way, so thank you.
I'm at the wrong microphone.
Oh, my other hemisphere.
So I'm, I guess, a fan of perversity in that I think
Good beginning.
I suspect that it's a real phenomenon, not just in the broad instrumental sense. And so if I understand you right, you think that actions that appear perverse but are actually instrumentally good, whether that's good rational, good morally, whatever, are all over the place, and actions that are genuinely perverse and that they are not done for any good or done in spite of good and aren't instrumentally doing good are unlikely to actually exist, that we're unlikely to
I
actually
use the
behave
term
that way.
agnostic, so unlikely. I'm
Okay.
happy with unlikely. I'm not sure.
Okay. What this reminds me of is actually a almost perfectly parallel debate over psychological egoism
Okay.
in the history of philosophy. So just the question of whether people act out of self-interest all the time. And it actually is perfectly similar because it is the question of perversity with the good limited to good for oneself, right? And there is, again, a narrow and a broad conception of acting out of self-interest. It's very easy to say people don't act out of self-interest, or people often act not out of self-interest because, look, I did something nice for someone else, and then the person who's a fan of broad self-interest says, well, yeah, but you did that nice thing for someone else because it actually does something nice for you, even if it just gives you that little glow feeling nice. And I take it everyone rejects that view today and thinks that there is genuine, narrow action out of not self-interest, action for the good of others and not oneself, because we've just come to realize that people value a huge variety of things, and not all of them are one's own well-being. And I wonder why that isn't enough motivation to think that perversity in the narrow sense is plausible as well. That for the same reason that when someone acts for someone else's interests, we don't go, but why? But why? I need an explanation that says why it's their own interest that benefits. Why in the case of perversity, we don't do the same thing?
I like that question. Everything you said about self-interest seems to me exactly right. And you nicely capture something, which is the claim that we do everything out of self-interest has always been frustrating to me, I think many other people, because either you mean it narrowly, specifically, in which case it's plainly wrong, like I help my kids, or it's so broad as to be, as to encompass any possible situation, and so just not that interesting, no matter what I say. Yeah, but you wouldn't have done it if you didn't want to. So you're right at where we've come up with, which is I think we've accepted that people just have a range of motivations. I might do something because it satisfies me, but I also do something because I love somebody, I want the person I love to be happy. But I don't think it's a limitless enumeration of possible motivation. I think each motivation sort of has to earn its keep. So you're right. It's not impossible that our minds could be wired up saying, to some extent, that I want to hurt people. And why? Well, that's just a pride. I just want to hurt people, period. There's no more to be said about it. Just like, I like sweet things. Why? Because you all like sweet things. But I think you need at least a sort of evolutionary or cultural or historical explanation of where this motivation would come from.
Okay, so if I can just
Sure.
follow up, yeah. So that motivation then doesn't need to be psychological. It might be that there are genuine, well, I guess the word is perverts, genuinely perverse people, and they're acting for, as far as their motivations are concerned, purely for perverse reasons. It's just that you can tell some historical story about why people have perverse reasons that makes it, in the broad scheme of things, rational, but considered psychologically still totally perverse.
So what would be, I'm sort of fond, I'm losing a little bit, if you meet a perverse agent and they do this perverse thing, and then you say, why do you do the perverse thing? And they say, I just want the perverse thing. Presumably it's something in their minds that motivates them to want it. And now, you're right, it doesn't have to have some other reason, but now you say, so how'd that get in your head?
Right.
And
you think the explanation could be totally non-psychological. It could just be evolutionary, cultural. It wouldn't have to put another motivation in the person's head. I wanted this, so I did this thing that seemed perverse.
Yes.
The motivations could be elsewhere, and the person would be, in a sense, genuinely perverse, but in a broader context.
So that's a nice way to frame it. Imagine, just to coin some terms, we have these sort of zero-order motivations. We just evolved. Why do babies like sweet stuff? Well, because the babies that didn't reproduce, and so you just have this prime, and there's no other story. Then we have this sort of first order, second order, third order. Why do people like money? Well, because they know it can buy things, they like the things to buy, and so on. I guess your claim, what you're suggesting, I think about, is that certain perverse behaviors could sort of be zero order. But for typical zero-order motivations, you appeal to an evolutionary account. Now, again, conceivably, it could just be this crazy mutation comes in, it could just be an accident. That's possible. But do you have such an account in mind for where these zero-order motivations could come from?
So I thought that's kind of what you were giving, especially with the fitness landscape graphs. There might just be, we often find ourselves at some point in gradient descent, and maybe it's evolutionary beneficial to have a 1 in 500 chance in every decision of doing the perverse thing.
There's a good point there. I think that's interesting, because it goes back to the mice, right? So I said, those mice who act impulsively, and that doesn't count as perversity. But in some way you're coming back and saying, well, why not? They're acting in ways that are counterproductive, that involve high degree of risk and so on. And it might be true that in their heads, they don't have any prior motivation. But still, they have an evolutionary history that gives rise to these behaviors. If true for mice, why not for people? So to sketch out what you're saying more, suppose adolescents have something that goes off in their head saying, do crazy shit. And they don't know why they're doing the crazy shit. It just goes off in their head. And there's no other thing going on. It's just this timer that evolution has set up. And it turns out, from an evolutionary perspective, those that do crazy shit end up doing better in life. But that other motivation is in the history. It's not in their heads. That would be in some way pure perversity from a psychological point of view. I like that. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks.
So we're approaching 8:30, which is the typical time we draw this to a close. If there's a last question or two, please come on down and ask it. Or, well, I'm not feeding his dragon here.
Or stories of your friend's perversity.
Yeah. Telling for a friend. But if not, then, okay, so Eric has something.
Going back to the way you ended your talk, you said, so from the quote, right? You suggested that it's a good thing if we have perversity. Is this just a purely academic interest, or you think that there's something genuinely good about perversity and making us better beings, or?
So, I'm a square. And us squares don't like perversity. I don't like perverse, unpredictable, irrational behavior in parts of other. I like people being well-behaved. But sometimes, so if I said perversity is good, I shouldn't say that. And I'm sort of working out the ideas in this talk, and I have a note to myself, don't say that. But sometimes I think perversity makes life more interesting. There's perversity that's cruel, that's senseless, that's destructive, but there's also perversity that the natural response is laughter. Not because it's sort of instrumental to getting a laugh, in which case it's probably not perverse, it's just social behavior, but there's some perversity that just, I think, makes the world a more interesting place. So in general, if I had to turn the dial of perversity, I do not know if I would turn it more. I might turn it less, but I wouldn't turn it to 0. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much for coming out. Please join me in